Our fellow teacher, Julie Brown Yao, is with us today to talk about the nature of developmental trauma. Julie is an author, a speaker, and has a 33-year background in psychological, somatic, and spiritual traditions. Welcome to AVAIYA, Julie.
Thank you for having me, Andy. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I would love it if we just dive right into developmental trauma, since that is one of your specialties. So can you talk about what developmental trauma is and who is susceptible to it?
Well, let's begin with who's susceptible to it. I believe all children are susceptible to developmental trauma. And I would even go so far as to say it's really a natural phenomenon. So we will all experience developmental trauma sometime in our childhood. And this can be anytime from in utero up to about 11 years of life. So even those of us who have this constancy or consistency of parental love and care are still susceptible to developmental trauma. So let me tell you why, why that can be. So developmental trauma, really, to speak about it simply, sort of a rather broad view, is to say it comes about when there is lack of attunement from the caregiver to the child, right, or the caregiver to the baby. So when we come into the world, or even in utero, we are completely dependent upon our caregivers, right? We have needs that have to be met by others to allow us to feel safe in our body, safe in the world, and safe in relationship. And so if there's lack of attunement from the caregivers or the parents or even the medical community, in a birthing situation, then the infant or the child can feel some form of a threat. And that threat in the body can feel too much for a child. And this can be the beginning of developmental trauma, because we disconnect from the body or the emotion or the threat or the fear, which leaves that unresolved in our body or our body brain. When I say body, I'm including nervous system and brain. Mm-hmm. And if that's not recognized by the caregivers, right, then it remains inside of us. And we learn to adapt to a world that isn't attuning to us in a way that we need to feel safe. And we adapt to try and get what we need in one way or another. So we can unpack that a little bit if you like, but that's really, the origins of developmental trauma, mm-hmm. right? Lack or inadequate caregiving.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, right? You talked about, how we can adapt to this lack of care, basically. What are some of the ways that we adapt? What are some of the, coping mechanisms we develop and in order to survive those scenarios?
Yeah. Well, there's many, and thank goodness we have them, because as you said, it does allow us to survive. So let's take an infant. An infant can learn that it's futile to cry out, right? And so will silence itself and not cry, because it learns nobody comes if I cry. Mm-hmm. And I'll speak a little bit more to that in a few moments. But we can also feel that, our voice or our protests are not heard, and in fact can cause even more disconnection than that might already be happening with our caregivers. So we learn to not protest, which shuts down our capacity of healthy aggression, which is really important to have, right? It allows people around us to know something's not going on or not feeling safe for us. We can learn to tend to other people instead of allowing ourselves to be tended to, because for some reason we perceived that wasn't going to work for ourselves as a child. Right? So we adapt to being the caregiver of others, or we learn that, the world isn't a place where we can trust. So we stop trusting and feel like we can only trust ourselves. So there's many adaptations that we can take on, and they help us in childhood, but in adulthood, these adaptations are really getting in the way of our self-expression, our capacity for connection, our open-heartedness, our relationships, our connection to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that's probably why a lot of us are here, right? Figuring out how to work through those. And I'm curious, in your work, you talk about, developmental trauma, which we've just been talking about. and then something called shock trauma. Can you share about like what, I know that these are different things and yet they can be intertwined. Can you share a little bit about how they're different and yet how they can be intertwined?
Yeah, absolutely. But then I give you an example. A gentleman that I was just working with, actually, he came to see me because of this terrible anxiety that he's carrying in his body and this ongoing thought process of how he's not good enough. And, really, and he's in his 50s and he's highly successful. Nobody would know in his internal world, he's feeling so dreadful about himself. So in our work together, what we uncovered was a shock trauma when he was about 4 or 5 years old. And the shock trauma was he put a knife, like a metal knife, into this electrical fire that was on the wall and got this horrible electric shock, which burnt his hand, right? So that was a shock trauma, this impact that hurt him, that terrified him, that was too much for his system, couldn't quite assimilate it. Now, there's different types of shock traumas, but that just gives you an idea of a shock trauma, an impact that's too much, terrifies us, kind of bowls us over in some way. Now, his parents heard him and came into the room where he was. Now, the parents, in a really loving way, could have gone over to him, held him, helped him calm his system, tended to the burn on his hand, told him he was going to be okay. And then maybe that shock that he had would not have embedded in his system as a trauma. However, the parents came in the room, saw what he'd done, and actually ridiculed him and then told him off. Like, how stupid can you be? I can't believe you did that. You deserve the pain. We've told you not to do this. Well, the boy just went into a deeper state of shock. So we have the shock trauma that embedded in his system. And then a developmental trauma is the parents not attuning to what he needed, which was really their acknowledgement of this shock that he'd gone through. He was 4 or 5 years old. He was still just experimenting, playing, not realizing what was going to happen. But the ridicule of his parents went into him and he realized, oh yeah, I'm stupid. I'm never going to be good enough. I always do something wrong. Right? And that imprints inside of him and he carries that forward. So he creates this split inside of himself, right? Of not being good enough, always going to do things wrong. And that shows up later in life as this as symptoms of anxiety.
Yeah, that's a great example. I'm glad you shared that because I'm sure a lot of people have had some kind of experience like that where perhaps, they weren't nurtured in the way they should have been, needed to be after having done something that kids do, right? That we get into stuff, right? Yeah.
And can create a tremendous amount of shame. So the symptoms of just that shock trauma could, of course, have caused a lot of anxiety in him if that hadn't been tended to. But the developmental trauma can also create a lot of symptoms of anxiety. So the symptoms of a shock or acute trauma can look very similar to developmental trauma, but they really do need to be addressed differently.
Gotcha. And I know that you also talk about developmental trauma being about disconnection. Can you talk a little bit about why that is?
Yeah. So developmental trauma, we are disconnecting from what feels too much for us to be able to bear as an infant or a child.